Hello, everyone. How are you all doing? Welcome back to today's lecture. Today, our topic is corruption in Africa. Gradually, the semester is coming to an end. Today, we are going to talk about corruption in Africa. So, corruption has always existed in different forms. It exists in all the countries across the world. In rich countries, you find some corruption. In poor countries, in international organizations, in individual companies, you find some form of corruption ongoing. This, according to Patrick Otiendu Lumumba, corruption is worse than prostitution. In his writing on corruption, he makes a comparison between corruption and prostitution, and then he concludes that corruption is worse than prostitution. The reason why he says corruption is worse than prostitution is that to him, the corruption only endangers the morals of the entire country, whilst prostitution endangers only the morals of the individual. What this means is that while the effects of corruption is on the entire country or an entire society, the effect of prostitution is just on the individual who is engaged in the act. And for that matter, corruption is worse than prostitution. Africa as a continent is considered one of the world's most corrupt places. According to the Transparency International, Transparency International is a leading global watchdog on corruption. According to them, when you take the first 10 corrupt countries in the world, you will find 6 of these countries in sub-Sahara Africa. And for that reason, Africa is considered as one of the world's most corrupt places. Corruption exists in various forms and it occurs in various modes. In Africa, for instance, you find corruption everywhere, in our churches, in our offices, during functions. In our churches, for instance, the rich people are treated differently from the poor. There are special seats for the rich, whilst the ordinary people are not regarded. The rich are given positions in the church. And for that matter, people are motivated to make money regardless of the means by which they acquire that wealth. The rich are idolized in society, and this causes people to engage in corrupt acts in order to make money, to be treated in that same manner. Examples of corrupt practices includes the issue of import and export permits. Sometimes people are able to acquire these permits through corrupt ways. At the port, when people come in to clear their goods, customs officers, if the duty is 10,000 cedis, the custom officer may charge 5,000 cedis and clear the goods for the person. So the custom officer gets 5,000 cedis, whilst the government gets nothing. When it comes to the allocation of resources, market stores, it's in our court systems, everywhere you find yourself, you find some form of corruption in the appointment of staff. When it comes to the promotion at the workplaces, people pay people in order to be given such favors. So the question is, did corruption exist in Africa before the coming of the Europeans? The answer is yes. Corruption did exist, but it existed in a different way. We have earlier indicated in this course that before the coming of the Europeans, African societies were ruled or supervised by the chief, their council of elders, and the family heads. Now, these leaders or these authorities wielded a lot of power and respect. They performed certain functions on behalf of the people. And because of these functions they performed, they were revered. And some of them abused the power that was imposed on them and then the reverence that people gave to them. So for instance, if I have an issue and I'm summoned before the chief, I can go and see one of the sub chiefs, give him probably some tubers of yam or a goat or something. with the intention that when the matter is called before the chief, this sub-chief is going to speak in my favor. So even if I am guilty, I'm going to be found innocent, or the level of punishment that is to be meted out to me can be reduced. There is an argument. Some scholars have argued that corruption did not exist in Africa. The reason is that it was normal in Africa for people to present gifts to their elders, to people in authority. And the presentation of gifts did not mean that those people were engaged in acts of corruption. Another school of thought, another scholars have also argued that yes, it's true, Africans are more prone to the giving of gifts. But in situations where that gift is supposed to induce the person to influence the outcome of a decision, then it is no longer a gift, but it becomes corruption. So the Europeans also came, and then fast forward, African countries gained their independence. One was hoping that with the attainment of independence, the African people were actually going to reverse some of the things that the Europeans have done. Whilst the Europeans were in power, they had all the African resources. So they lived in the big houses, they drank the expensive wines, they drove in the big cars. Some of them had access to the beautiful black women. And these African people complained about the lifestyle of the Europeans, and they were tagged as corrupt. But instead of the African people reversing these attitudes when the Europeans were kicked out of Africa, they rather stepped into their shoes and lived the lifestyle that the Europeans were living. This meant that whilst the Europeans were living this lavish lifestyle, the African people were actually admiring it and did not waste any time to step into that shoes and to live that kind of life. So today, people become politicians not because they have the interest of the country at heart, but because they want to make money for themselves. People are engaged in the exchange of all forms of commissions and kickbacks in order to make money for themselves. These African leaders, from there up till today, are still engaged in practices that allows them to amass wealth at the detriment of the ordinary people. On this table, you find a list of names of some African leaders, the countries where they come from, and then the fortune they had amassed in terms of wealth. And you realize that some of them, if you compare their personal money, the money they had as individuals, it was more than the money that their countries even had. So the question is, where did they get all these monies from? Since their role as presidents and their salaries could not have amounted to this amount of money over the period of time that they were in power. This meant that the African leaders exploited their people to make wealth for themselves. We've been talking about corruption. The question now is, what is corruption? So let's define corruption. Corruption, according to the Transparency International, is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So when a power has been entrusted to you and then you abuse it for your personal gain or your personal interest, that is what is referred to as corruption. The World Bank also defines corruption as the abuse of public office for private gain. According to Nukunya, Nukunya is a Ghanaian author. He wrote this in the year 1992. According to him, corruption is the practice associated with the giving and the receiving of bribes. Now, let's look at the types of forms of corruption. The first one is bribery. Bribery is defined as an offer of money or favor to influence a public official. So where you give money or you do something for someone, a public official, in order to influence the decision of that person, then it becomes bribery. Bribery requires two participants. There is the giver and there is the taker. And it is said that in bribery, both the giver and the taker are at fault. Sometimes you may go to an office to, let's say, to seek for the services of that public office. But when you go there, you are asked to pay a certain amount of money before that service can be rendered to you. That is an example of bribery. The second one is embezzlement. Embezzlement is simply the outright theft or stealing of entrusted funds. When some monies have been given to you and then you steal this money, that is what is referred to as embezzlement. It becomes political when it involves public money taken by a responsible public official. When the money of an entire country is given to you to undertake certain projects, and then at the end of the day, you are unable to account for it, and the money is also missing, the project is not completed, then it becomes embezzlement of the public fund. An example of embezzlement is when people use entrusted government resources for their personal gain. For instance, have been given an office car, and the purpose of that car is to help me convey myself from the house to work and to perform my work duties effectively. By the end of the day, I end up using that car to go for funerals, go for parties. My son is driving it. My husband is also driving it. It is a misuse of government resources. That can also be termed as embezzlement. The third type of corruption is nepotism and cronyism. Nepotism and cronyism refers to favoritism shown by public officials to relatives or close friends. We say nepotism when that favoritism is shown to relatives of that public official. And then we talk about cronyism when that favoritism is shown to close friends of that public official. So for instance, in a public office, you realize that the assistant manager is the manager's nephew. The accountant may be the manager's old schoolmate. Then the director of finance is also another person related to the manager. In situations like this, then we refer to it as nepotism and cronyism. Sometimes these people may not even qualify for the positions that they've been given, but because they are related to the person in charge, they are put into those positions. Number 4 is electoral fraud. Electoral fraud refers to the illegal interference with the process of an election. And usually these interferences is done whether to increase the votes of one contender over the other and to decrease the votes of the other person. It occurs in various forms. Sometimes children who are not up to the age of 18 are registered. People who may not be nationals of the country may also be registered in order to increase the votes of one party. Sometimes there is intimidation at the polling station, there is ballot stuffing. All of these things are examples of electoral fraud, and it is an example of corruption because it interferes in the electoral process in order for somebody to benefit from it. Number 5 is what is referred to as kickbacks. A kickback is an official share of misappropriated funds allocated from one organization to the other involved in a corrupt bidding. So for instance, there is this public office who wants to embark on a road construction. So instead of them announcing it or publishing it so that so many contractors will bring their proposals, and the company or the office can choose the best, more efficient and less expensive proposal, they give it to one person. So this contractor may have gone to see the person in charge, probably the manager, and then promises that if you give me this contract, I'm going to give you this percentage of the money that I'll be giving. And because of that, that person ends up getting their contract. So the amount of money that the contractor will give to the manager as part of the share of the entire cost is what is referred to as kickbacks. Number 6 is patronage. Patronage refers to favoring supporters of a particular government. Example, with government employment. So you supported this particular person or this government during elections. So when they come into power, they help you in getting employment. So there's police recruitment, they push you in it. There's army recruitment, they push you in it. There is a vacancy in an office and they push you in it. Sometimes the people are not even qualified, but because they help that particular person or that particular government to win power, they are given those positions. So in patronage, people are rewarded for their loyalty rather than their qualification. The last type is what is referred to as extortion. Extortion involves the coercive incentives, such as the use of threats of violence or the exposure or damaging information in order to induce cooperation. So, for instance, I met Amma with a guy somewhere. Then I need Amma to wash my clothes for me. I tell Amma and the Amma refuses. So I tell Amma, if you don't wash my clothes, I'm going to tell your mother that I saw you with this particular boy. And because Amma doesn't want her mother to know, she is compelled to do for me what I have asked her to do by washing my clothes. So the act of using an information that you have about somebody or something to force or compel that person to do for you what he or she would ordinarily not do, that is what is referred to as extortion. Pedersen and Johansson in the year 2008 gave two typologies of corruption. According to them, corruption can be categorized into two main forms. There is the petty corruption and then grand corruption. Petty corruption, according to Pedersen and Johansson, refers to corruption that occurs at the lower levels of administration, whilst grand corruption is the type of corruption that occurs at the middle and higher level of public administration and is directly related to political fear and then people who are in top political positions. Now, let's look at the causes of corruption in Africa. The first type we are going to talk about is negative colonial legacy. We have earlier indicated that the Europeans were living a certain lifestyle and this lifestyle was attractive to the African people, and for that matter, they followed suit and then were engaged in the acts of corruption. There is also poor leadership on the part of the African leaders. There is politics of the belly. People who get into politics do so because they want to amass wealth for themselves and their families rather than the interest of the entire country. There is greed and selfishness. People always want more than what they have, and sometimes they think they deserve more than what they are receiving, which makes them engage in acts of corruption. There is clientelism, patronage, and nepotism. The next one is weak institutions of governance. Yes, the government institutions are very weak, so people are able to influence them. Sometimes it is not even the people who influence them. The workers in these government institutions rather request for briberies in order to perform their functions. And the government institutions that are supposed to check the behaviors of people engaged in corruption and punish them are also unable to do so. There is the lack of transparency and accountability. People use government funds, and they are not able to account for it. There's no transparency in their dealings, and nobody holds them accountable to it. And then lastly, the lack of political will. Politicians most of the times, while in opposition, promises to tackle corruption once they are voted into power, but immediately they are voted into power, they lack the will and the zeal to fight the acts of corruption. Let's look at the general effects of corruption on African societies. In Africa, one of the main effects of corruption is the loss of revenue to society. Let's say, for instance, you want to do a passport, and then you pay 100 cedis for the passport form. But when you finish, you may have to pay 500, 600, sometimes even 1,000 cedis to somebody in order to get your passport printed. So at the end of the day, the government only receives 100 cedis, whilst about 500 or 600 cedis goes to an individual. So the government loses out of revenue at the expense of the individual. Sometimes at the ports, the custom officer may take 500 and clear your goods for you instead of you paying 1,000 cedis to the government. So the custom officer gets 5,000 cedis and the government gets nothing. Another effect of corruption is that it undermines economic performance, leading to underdevelopment. The third one, it disrupts and destroys social order and public trust in the institutions that are well noted to be corrupt institutions. People lose trust in them. Sometimes when you have an issue and then you are tempted to go to the police or go to court, you feel like you don't need to go there because they are not going to assess your issue the way they are supposed to do, because you may think that they are engaged in acts of corruption, thereby losing your trust in their ability to help you resolve your problem. It also weakens democratic institutions and the rule of law. The more government agencies take bribes from people, the less efficient they become in dealing with the issues of corruption. And then lastly, it also exploits human persons for self-interest. The next topic, which is going to be our last discussion, we are going to look at the practical approaches or the practical ways that we can solve the problem of corruption in Africa. The first point is that we need to strengthen anti-corruption and good governance institutions. Institutions like SHRAJ, institutions like YOCO, the Ghana Police Service, and presently we have the Special Prosecutor. These institutions should be strengthened. Their capacities should be built. They should be given the needed resources in order for them to discharge their duties very well in combating corruption. There should also be public education on the issue of corruption. People should be educated well on the effects of corruption. The churches should educate their members. The lecturers should educate their students. The National Commission on Civic Education should also educate the general public. Again, the bureaucratic red tape should be streamlined. There is so much bureaucracy in our government systems. When you want to do something, you need to go through so many people. And at every stage, some of these people request for money and other forms of gifts in order to perform that function. So when these bureaucracies are cut, it will also help reduce corruption. Again, there should be the enactment of strict laws to punish people who are found guilty of the acts of corruption. This will serve as deterrence to other people. There should also be reduction on the dependency on foreign aid. Yes, it is according to the African Union, the African continent loses to corruption an amount of about $50 billion US dollars, whilst they amass about $22.5 billion in foreign aid. And because African people or the African countries are more reliant on foreign aid, they are not showing so much energy into combating corruption. So one way we can reduce corruption is to reduce the dependency on foreign aid, because you realize that the amount of money African countries are losing to corruption is more than the amount of money they get through or they get from the foreign aid. Thank you very much for watching. This brings us to the end of today's lecture. I'll see you again. Bye.